Welcome to how to add and subtract positive and negative decimals. One of the important factors that you need to remember in order to add and subtract positive and negative decimals is the idea of place value. Make sure that your place value is completely, or your place values are lined up before you begin a problem. Remember to hit pause in order to write anything down, as I will be moving a little bit quicker on screen as you'll be able to write down or hit pause in order to write down any notes. All right, so we first started off with rounding, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on rounding because it seems like you all remember that from 6th grade or 5th grade elementary school. But remember, if I need to round to the nearest whole number, my whole number is anything that is not a fraction or a decimal. So in front of the decimal are my whole numbers. I want to know, is this number closer to 4 or closer to 5? It's in between 4 and 5. Which one is it closer to as a whole number? I usually look at the number behind it. Remember, if it is a 5 or higher, I round up. If it is less than 5, if the number is less than 5, then I stay the same. This number here, since it is a 3, it is less than 5, so the 4 stays the same. I can place a 0 in the placeholder of the tenths since I'm not referring to the tenths place anymore. But I don't have to. I could also simply just write it as a 4. 4.3 is closer to 4 than 5. One question that came out during class lessons today is, what does this little bar on top mean? Well, remember, that is the repetition bar. It's a repeating bar telling me that this number 6 is just going to continue to repeat itself over and over and over again. When I look at that, it also then helps me, if this is my whole number, to look at, well, how is this going to repeat? How's it going to affect my whole number? Remember, this is between 8 and 9. This number is closer to the 9. That 6 tells me to round that number higher. Here, my number is 18. My whole number is 18. The 1 tells me that the 8 is going to stay the same. So this whole number is still 18. 18 and 1500ths is closer to 18 than it is to 19. Same idea with rounding. We're going to talk a little bit about the tenths spot. Go back and refer to the place value chart you just did, or know that the tenths is the first place value after the decimal. It is the representation of what a dime would be, or 1/10 of a number. So now we want to round to the tenth. I'm not looking at the whole number anymore. I'm looking at the numbers behind the tenth. The 34 are still important. I need to keep that number. However, now I look behind. This 7 tells me to round the 8 up to a 9. And I'll remain with that 0 on the end. Again, I'm going to underline my 5. I look to the number behind. That's simply a 1, which tells me that it's going to remain the same. The 5 does not change. And then I can put a 0 in the place of everything else. Hit pause, try C and D, and see what you get. Thank you for joining me again. If I was to round these, I would round it to 29.3. And for this one, it would be 0.8. I hope you did well. Go ahead and hit pause, try these 4, and then come back. Notice that it has changed to 100th. All right, so now 10th, 100th spot is right here. The 44.2 is going to remain, but that 5 is going to turn into a 6. In this case, 10th, 100th. 5.3, that 1 is not going to change anything there, so that will stay the same. Finally, C and D. Oh, see, we run into a problem with this because that's going to make me want to round it up to a 10, right? But if I look here, that number is smaller. So remember that if I do this, this is the 100th spot, and I'm saying that I have 10 100ths. And 10 100ths in reduced form is the same as 1/10. So that would put my decimal point right here. All right, in class we spent some time adding and subtracting decimals. I want to look at a few decimals to begin with. Remember, it's important to line up our place values. So if I have these two numbers, I want to line them up with the place value. Here is 1 whole, 7/10, 5/100. Here I have 13 wholes, 2/10, 0/100. It told me to add them, so I'm putting them and I'm going to add them together. 5 plus a 0 is 5, 7 plus 2 is 9, 3 plus 1 is 4, and a 1. Very simple adding once I line up all my place values. So I'm going to do the same thing for this one. 8 and 1/10. 9 and 876 thousandths. Well, then I need to fill in those place values with a spot holder 0. Add them together. The zeros are always nice to work with, and you get your final answer. Subtraction is no different. In this case, I have 10 and 3/10, and I need to take away 7 and 175 thousandths. Well, I can't do that because this number on top doesn't have any hundredths and doesn't have any thousandths. So I hold their value with a 0. I have nothing here to subtract from, so I borrow from the 3 from the tens place. It gives me 10 hundredths. Remember that from before. 1/10 is the same as 10 hundredths. Now I need to borrow from the hundreds to give me 10 thousandths. And now I can subtract and get my answer. And same thing with the last problem. Most of you were able to solve those very easily. There were no concerns, no more problems there. However, we started to have concerns when we brought in the negative signs. I'm going to spend the remainder of this lesson, the remainder of the video, just going over how to add and subtract positive and negative decimals. I'll start with these 4 examples from our lesson today and then show you some additional problems to work through. Let's start with A and B. I'm happy with A and B because they're adding, so I don't have a whole lot of stress in my life. I'm going to think about this using some common sense. I notice that this is a negative 1.5, and I'm adding to it more negatives. So it's as if the temperature went down 1.5 degrees and then went down another 11. Altogether, it went down a great bunch. So I know my final answer is going to be negative, and all I have to do is add these together to figure out how far negative it went. I have a total of negative 12.7. How about this problem? I have some positives and some negatives. So I'm going to compare it like it was on a balance scale. Here's my balance scale with my fulcrum. I'm going to put 18 positive signs over here. Should all be positive signs. And 9 negative signs over here. Notice I'm just starting with some estimation to help myself out. Well, what do I notice? I notice that there are way more positives. This scale is going to go deeper here. So I know my final answer will be positive. But how do I figure out which one has more? Well, I need to find the difference. I need to subtract. So I'm going to take 18.1, 18 and 1/10, and I'm going to subtract 9 and 876 thousandths. Notice that I fill in my placeholders. This is 10, 9, 0. I'm going to have to borrow from here. So 10 and 6 is 4, 9 and 7 is 2, 10 and 8 is 2, 17 and 9 is 8 with the decimal. So I have a positive 8 and 224 thousandths. Again, what did I do first? I used some common sense to see which one had more. Positives had more. And then I just subtracted the two numbers. It's the same idea down here, except I grind to a halt when I see that. That confuses my brain, just like it did with the regular integers. So I'm going to change that. I'm going to do my little additive inverse, add the opposite, and I'm going to turn this into adding a positive instead. So adding a positive instead. Now I look at if I was to do my scale, and again, I'm not going to draw this for every single one, but it's a good visual. I would have 10 negatives. 1, 2, that should be 10. That looks like 1 there. So we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I have 7 positives. Again, I'm just estimating to give myself an idea of where to start. There are more negatives than positives, so I know my answer is going to be negative. Well, what is the difference between the two? How many more does one have than the other? And that just tells me then to subtract. 10 minus 7 and 175 thousandths. Notice how I put the place value holders in there? And then I can do my subtracting. Oops, 3, 1, 2, 5. Then I bring my answer back over, and my negative sign is already there waiting. Same idea here, but this negative sign is going to throw me off, so I'm going to add the opposite. Adding the opposite, I notice that if I made my scale, I would put 17 negatives over here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. And then I also have 9 negatives. Oh, okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Well, what happened? They're all negatives. So I know my answer is negative, and all I'm going to do is add those two numbers together. 17 and 91 thousandths plus 9 and 8 tenths. Hold my place values with those zeros. And I would get a negative, I'll have to move this so I have enough room, negative 26 and 891 thousandths. All right, as I promised, I want to continue doing some more adding and subtracting decimal problems. So I just have a list of them here. I have 15 problems. I am going to do half of them adding and half of them subtracting. So I'm going to very quickly, change this up a little bit. We're going to make all these subtracting. So that's a subtracting. That's a subtracting. Try and see if I can get a fairly perfect one here. And I'll just copy it. This a negative. We'll just make some of those negatives. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll solve some of these problems here. What do I have going on here? These are gigantic numbers. Well, I know I'm adding them, so I'm happy. It would be similar if I wrote it horizontally this way, and maybe that's better for some of you, if I see it that way. When I look at a problem like this, I know that I have 600 negatives and 233 positives, and that I'm already adding. Well, there better be an efficient way to do this, because I am not going to write out 679 negative signs. I can tell that 679 negative signs is going to be more than 233 positive signs, so I know my answer is going to be negative. If you can remember your balance scale, now you just have to say by how much. Well, now it's real simple. Ignore the negative sign there and just subtract these like you would any other time. So I have to make this a 14, and I would be borrowing from this, which had to borrow from that, so that would be an 8 and a 9. So 14 minus 7 is 7, 9 minus 5 is 4, 8 minus 3 is 5, 7 minus 3 is 4. 4, my decimal points, my answer should be somewhere in the 400s. There we go. All right, if you think you've got this down, why don't you go ahead and hit pause, try a few of the problems on the screen, and come back. This bottom row I'm going to save and let you do all of those by yourself. So if you're not comfortable yet, feel free to watch a few more, and then you can come back and try the bottom row in a few minutes. All right, so I'm looking at this problem again. I notice I have 800 negatives, 130 positives, and I'm adding. Since I'm adding, I'm happy, so I know that I have more negatives than positives. And since that's the case, all I have to do is subtract them. 9 minus 4 is 5. 2, 2, 0, 7. with the decimal. All right, now I'm going to write this problem horizontally because, again, sometimes that's easier for people to tell. And when I look at this, I see that I'm subtracting, and subtraction is not making me very happy. So instead of subtracting, I'm going to change this to add the opposite. Now I see that I have 331 negatives and 17 negatives. So I'm going to sit and think to myself, well, that means all of them are negative. And if they're all negative, all I have to do is add these two problems together. 0, 18, 9, 4, 3. That's going to be the same for all of these. This is a negative 199 and minus a 30, negative 199 and 7/100 minus 30 and 22/100. All I have to do is add the opposite. Oh, I thought that would stay. I apologize. All I have to do is add the opposite. Now again, I have 199 negatives, 30 negatives. They're all negative, so my answer will be negative, and add these up. 7, 8, 9, 2, 9, 12, 2. So now the question becomes, Miss Bednar, what if this was in parentheses and it was minus? What if this was negative 667 and 62/100 minus a negative 67 and 20/100? Well, let's do the same thing. If I write it horizontally, negative 667 and 62/100 minus a negative 67 and 20/100. In order to solve a problem like that, I want to make sure that I'm adding, and in doing so, now I'm going to be adding the opposite. When I add the opposite, I see that I have 600 negatives, 67 positives. I have way more negatives, so I know my answer is negative. Because I know my answer is negative, now I can just subtract 667, and 62/100 minus 67 and 20/100. 2, 4, 0, 0, 6. 6, 0, 0, 4. Oh, 2. Sorry, not a 7. Can't read my own writing. All right, hit pause. Try the last few here. But before you do, let's make that problem look like this and make this problem look like this. Okay? So in order to solve this problem, you are going to hit pause, solve them all, come back and see what you get.
Oh, I was just waiting for when the cam starts. When does it start?
I'm not sure. I'm recording right now.
Competition.
Oh, the math competition?
Yeah.
3:30. But you can
So I
stay here.
Go home.
I would stay here. Get your stuff and line up outside the door. Okay? All right, so back to this. I apologize for that. When you're solving this problem right here, hopefully that gave you a little bit more work time. When you're solving this problem here, I notice that I have 700 negatives, 300 positives. I have more negatives. Since I have more negatives and I know that the problem is adding, all I have to do is subtract. And hopefully you did that already. All right. This one, again, if I write it side by side like this, I have minus a negative 228.35. With the minus a negative, I want to add the opposite. So now I have 500 negatives, 200 positives. I have more negatives. And I want to subtract the numbers that I have. So 2, 2, 1, 0, 3. So 301.22. Okay, this problem right here, just regular. It's already adding. I have more negatives than positives, so I know my answer is going to be negative. I'm going to write off to the side here. And then I just have to do some subtraction. 11s would be 8, 4, 2, 2, 1. Negative 122 and 48/100ths. In this case, if I wrote it horizontally, I would have 17 and 93/100ths minus 15 and 63/100ths. If I do the opposite, additive inverse, then what I notice is I have 17 negatives and 15 negatives. They're all going into the same pot. They're all going to be negative, and I just want to add them together. So as I add these together, sorry, I can't multitask very well right now, I get 33.56. Last but not least, I have these two numbers. They're already adding. 309 is bigger than 301. 309 is negative, so I know my answer is negative. Now all I have to do is subtract these. 2 minus 1 is 1. 3 minus 6 I can't do, so I'm going to have to borrow from the ones. 13 minus 6 is 7. 8 minus 1 is 7. 0, 0, so I don't even need that. So it's just a negative 7 and 71/100ths. I hope having the opportunity to watch a few extra sample problems has helped you. If not, there are many resources out there. Khan Academy has a few videos online that you can watch, and Kuda Math has a few additional worksheets that you can solve. Again, I hope this has helped you, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask in class.